December 1979. The Red Army crosses into Afghanistan with 85,000 troops, T-72 tanks, Mi-24 attack helicopters, and the most advanced military doctrine the socialist bloc has to offer. Kremlin planners have penciled in 6 months to stabilize the country, install a friendly government, and slip out quietly. They'll need 9 years, and even then, they'll leave defeated. Not defeated by another conventional army, not defeated by a rival superpower, defeated by fighters with no air force, no armor, no military industry, men who knew every rock, every cave, every trail in mountains that have been swallowing empires for centuries. This is the story of how a nuclear superpower was tactically humiliated in the mountains of Central Asia. It's the story of how every Soviet advantage was neutralized, how every adaptation was met with a counter-adaptation, and how a war that was supposed to last 6 months became the wound that bled the Soviet Union dry. But above all, it's a story about tactics, about decisions made in dark gorges, in nameless valleys, in underground bases powered by gasoline generators, about how a people who couldn't win on paper found the exact way to win in reality. If you want to understand why conventional military power isn't enough to win a war when an entire nation decides to resist, stay with me, because what you're about to see is still studied by armies around the world today. Welcome to Battles in Action. An army built for the wrong war. To understand why the Red Army failed tactically in Afghanistan, you first have to understand what it was built for. And the answer is straightforward. It wasn't built for counterinsurgency. It wasn't built for mountains. It was built for one thing: massive conventional war across the plains of Central Europe against NATO. Soviet doctrine revolved around that scenario. Armored columns racing west at full speed. Massive artillery shaping the battlefield. Air superiority crushing any resistance. It was a war machine designed to fight World War III in Germany, not to patrol the valleys of the Hindu Kush, not to identify a sniper in a mud brick village. When the 40th Army crossed into Afghanistan, it carried that mindset with it. Its officers had spent decades training for the European theater. Their manuals described large-scale operations with hundreds of tanks and heavy air support. And suddenly, they found themselves in a country where roads were traps, where the enemy didn't wear uniforms, and where every victory on the ground evaporated in days. Colonel General Vasily Marimsky, one of the commanders forced to adapt his units to Afghan reality, admitted it with a blunt honesty that's almost painful in his memoirs. When our troops were deployed to Afghanistan and fighting against the insurgents began, I requested a general analysis of the Soviet partisan struggle against the Germans in World War II. Unfortunately, we never received it. An army that needed to study its own guerrilla history in order to understand the enemy it was facing. That tells you everything about the level of preparation they arrived with. The mission assigned to the 40th Army made the problem even harder. Those 85,000 men were expected to protect roughly 20,000 kilometers of roads across the country. That immobilized 3/4 of the force in more than 800 isolated outposts, the so-called Astavi, spread across an immense, hostile territory. Many of these posts were vulnerable positions overlooked by high ground, supplied by convoys that ran the same predictable routes again and again. The Soviets did have genuinely capable units, elite paratroopers and Spetsnaz formations with specialized training. But there weren't many of them. The bulk of the force was made up of conscripts with no counterinsurgency experience, tied to heavy vehicles in terrain designed to destroy them. It was like sending a heavyweight boxer into a wrestling match. The size and power were there. The specific skills for that kind of fight weren't. The enemy they didn't understand. One of the Soviets' most costly mistakes was underestimating how complex the enemy really was. The Mujahideen weren't a unified army with a clear chain of command you could decapitate. They were more than 30 different groups operating out of Pakistan, shaped by tribal, ethnic, and ideological structures that differed sharply from one another. The so-called Peshawar 7 were the most important, Sunni Muslims, mostly Pashtun. 4 of them were radical Islamists, including Hizb-e-Islami under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. 3 others were more moderate Islamists. Iran also backed 8 separate Shiite groups with their own agendas. And in the northern mountains, commanders like Ahmad Shah Massoud operated with near-total autonomy from the Peshawar structures. What united these groups was simple: opposition to Soviet intervention and to atheistic Marxism. What divided them was almost everything else. From their vision of an Islamic state, to centuries-old tribal and ethnic rivalries, to power struggles between leaders who cordially hated each other. Hekmatyar put it with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. This revolution is an Islamic revolution. Its objectives are to establish a pure Islamic system in Afghanistan and to liberate the country. For the Soviet Union, used to confronting liberation movements with Marxist narratives it could analyze and anticipate, this was completely unfamiliar terrain. Their counterinsurgency manuals did not account for fighters driven by religious conviction, for whom dying in battle could be a victory, not a defeat. Pakistan was the key actor behind this entire network. General Zia-ul-Haq saw the Soviet invasion as a historic opportunity. A friendly Afghanistan could be the first step toward a regional Islamic confederation that would counter Indian influence. Pakistan's ISI controlled the distribution of weapons and funds among the Mujahideen factions, and it systematically favored the most radical groups, like Hekmatyar's, to maximize Pakistani influence in a future Afghanistan. The United States provided money and weapons without tightly controlling where they ended up. Saudi Arabia matched the CIA dollar for dollar, driven by its own fear of Shiite Iranian expansionism. China shipped weapons compatible with Soviet standards, making them harder to trace. The United Kingdom operated through M16 with its trademark discretion, selectively backing commanders like Massoud, who showed real strategic capacity. It was an alliance of convenience among actors with divergent interests, united only by the desire to bleed the USSR. No one was thinking about the long-term consequences of arming and financing radical Islamists in the mountains of Central Asia. That bill would come due decades later. The first lessons: the Kunar Valley, the first major Soviet operation against the Mujahideen in the Kunar Valley, set the pattern that would repeat for the next 9 years. And it did so in the most painful way possible. Insurgents had been attacking Afghan army positions in the valley and then melting back into the civilian population. The Soviet response plan was classic and on paper solid. Trap the Mujahideen between airborne paratroopers dropped from the sky and a mechanized column advancing by land. A clean pincer movement, exactly what European manuals prescribed. The problem was reconnaissance, which was practically non-existent. The paratroopers dropped straight onto prepared enemy positions. The mechanized column drove into an ambush. Soviet soldier Yuri Tinkov, who lived to tell it, described those first minutes with chilling precision. When I looked around, I saw about 50 guerrillas advancing toward us. They fired accurately. Clearly they'd been waiting for us for some time. They knew we wore body armor, so they aimed for arms and heads. The Soviets eventually cleared the valley by sending in better trained reserves and using intensive Mi-24 helicopter support, leaving roughly 1,000 dead among Mujahideen and civilians. From the standpoint of the after-action report, it was a victory. From the strategic standpoint, it was a complete failure. The moment Afghan government forces left the valley, the Mujahideen returned, as if nothing had happened. The ground pacified yesterday was back in insurgent hands tomorrow. This pattern would repeat in every operation over the next 9 years. The Soviets could seize any territory they wanted. Holding it was a completely different matter. The weakness of the Allied Afghan army made the structural problem worse. It suffered from poor training, collapsed morale, an officer corps split between the two communist PDPA factions, and constant mass desertions. Kabul tried to boost recruitment and tighten discipline with little success. By the end of 1980, only 30,000 of the 100,000 soldiers the army supposedly had were still on duty, and many deserters took heavy equipment with them, equipment that ended up directly in Mujahideen hands. In many areas, the situation reached extremes that revealed just how badly the Soviet project was failing. Journalist Mike Winchester saw something in Kanabad that stunned him. Whenever the Afghan army and a handful of Soviet advisors stayed inside their walls, an unofficial ceasefire could be observed. A regular supply of ammunition from the fort to the Mujahideen and a flow of food in the opposite direction reinforced everyone's interest in maintaining that happy state of affairs. The Allied army supplying ammunition to the enemy in exchange for food. If you had to choose one image to sum up the state of the Soviet effort in Afghanistan, it would be that. Ambush as an art form. If there's one tactic that defines the Afghan war, it's the ambush. The Mujahideen made it their primary tool within the first months of the conflict and refined it over 9 years into a devastating precision still studied in military manuals around the world. The logic of the Afghan ambush was simple and brutal. Identify a choke point, a gorge, a bridge, a tight bend where vehicles had to slow down. Place shooters on the high ground on both sides of the road. Wait. And when the convoy arrived, execute the sequence the Soviets began to live with in nightmares. Destroy the first and last vehicle at the same time. That move created what militaries call a convoy closure. The vehicles in the middle were trapped, unable to move forward or backward, exposed to fire from elevated positions where Soviet tank guns couldn't effectively aim. A T-72 is formidable in open terrain. In a gorge, with hillsides full of shooters 45 degrees above it, it's a steel trap. Mujahideen commander Muhammad Akbar described his first ambush against a Soviet convoy with a clarity that needs no embellishment. We let the convoy pass, and when the tail of the column reached the ruins, we attacked. There was practically no resistance or reaction from the column. Even the escort APCs were passive. We moved along the column firing as we went and destroyed or damaged almost all the vehicles. We suffered no casualties. 0 casualties on their side. The column wrecked. That asymmetry in cost was exactly what the guerrillas needed to survive and grow. Main supply roads became permanent traps. The route between Kabul and Jalalabad saw so many ambushes that the Soviets began calling it, informally, the Road of Death. Traveling it required a level of mental preparation no training manual had ever imagined for 18-year-old conscripts. Supply convoys, forced to run these routes regularly to feed and fuel isolated outposts, took constant losses that piled up week after week. The psychological effect went far beyond physical casualties. No Soviet soldier could feel safe at any time. The enemy might be the farmer who waved at you in the morning. It might be the child running alongside your vehicle. It could be anywhere and nowhere. That permanent uncertainty generated cumulative stress the Soviet command neither knew how nor wanted to officially acknowledge. But it manifested in the increasingly violent and indiscriminate behavior of some units toward civilians, which in turn produced more recruits for the jihad. a vicious cycle with no obvious exit. The Mujahideen struck in cities too. In September 1983, in the village of Patwab Ishana, Soviet troops poured flammable chemical products into irrigation canals where civilians were hiding, killing more than 100 people in the fire that followed. The war was growing more savage in both directions, but with one crucial difference. Soviet brutality drove refugees into Pakistani camps radicalized and ready to join the resistance. Every atrocity became, unintentionally, a Mujahideen recruiting drive. Massoud and the Panjshir, guerrilla warfare. As a science of all the Mujahideen commanders, Ahmad Shah Massoud gave the Red Army the most headaches for the longest time. And it wasn't luck or coincidence. It was because Massoud applied an intellectual discipline to guerrilla warfare that his Soviet opponents took years to recognize and never fully managed to neutralize. Massoud had studied engineering in Kabul before joining the Islamist resistance in the 1970s. He read Mao, studied the classic theorists of guerrilla warfare, and fused those ideas with an intimate understanding of the terrain and his people. The result was a guerrilla doctrine remarkably sophisticated for a commander operating in mountains with unreliable communications and no guaranteed supply lines. Britain quickly identified him as the kind of commander who could change the course of the conflict. MUI6's Far East chief, Jerry Warner, instructed one of his officers with a line that says everything: "I want you to go to Afghanistan and find Napoleon while he's still an artillery officer." Massoud was that Napoleon, and the British were right. Massoud himself explained his view of the conflict to a French journalist with a clarity that showed why he was different. First, we don't have enough weapons. Second, we have to make sure there are enough people available to keep the economy, the farms, and the administration running. There is a role for everyone. However, if the critical moment really comes, everyone will be ready to fight. We had women firing at the enemy during Russian attacks. He wasn't just thinking about how to win battles. He was thinking about how to keep a society functioning during war. That strategic vision set him apart from almost all his contemporaries. The Panjshir Valley was his territory and his fortress. Located northeast of Kabul, it was strategically vital for the Soviets, a natural highway toward Mujahideen bases in the mountains and the Pakistani border. If the Soviets controlled Panjshir, they would cut one of the resistance's main supply routes. Between 1980 and 1985, they launched 9 massive offensives to take it. All 9 failed. Massoud's tactical doctrine rested on 3 pillars that worked as an integrated system. The first was superior intelligence. Massoud built a network of informants in every village in the valley and beyond, with messenger systems capable of relaying information about Soviet movements within hours. Before any operation began, he already knew how many men were coming, by which route, and when. That information advantage was more valuable than any weapon. The second pillar was elastic defense. Instead of fixed positions that would be smashed by Soviet firepower, Massoud established multiple lines of light resistance, each designed to slow and exhaust Soviet advances, while the bulk of his forces and the civilian population withdrew into higher ground. The Soviets took terrain, but they never caught the Mujahideen. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The third pillar was the counterattack during the Soviet withdrawal. An invading force is most vulnerable on the way out. Lines stretch, attention relaxes, columns are burdened with wounded and equipment. Massoud studied every Soviet pullback and struck at the moment of maximum vulnerability. This pattern produced some of the heaviest Soviet losses of the entire conflict. The 5th Panjshir offensive in 1982 illustrates the dynamic perfectly. The Soviets assembled their largest force to date, 12,000 troops, 320 tanks, 150 artillery pieces, and 100 helicopters against Massoud's 4,000 men, organized into 6 mobile combat groups. The Mujahideen ambushed the Soviets in the valley's narrow points, fired from the ridgelines, and conducted a fighting withdrawal over 2 weeks, inflicting 1,500 Soviet and Afghan casualties. When the operation ended, Massoud's force had escaped virtually intact. Soviet outposts established in the valley soon became permanent targets for new ambushes. An Estonian soldier who took part in those operations captured the Soviet troops' mental state with an honesty official propaganda would never have allowed to be published. You never know what could be around the next corner. The worst thing about these attacks is that many become completely savage. In those moments, some seem sadistic. There is death in front and behind, shots, bursts, and in that crazed storm, you start yelling to psych yourself up. Massoud also proved to be as skilled a negotiator as he was a guerrilla. In 1983, when Soviet intelligence proposed a truce in Panjshir, he accepted. This enraged the CIA and the ISI, who saw it as an unacceptable concession. But Massoud turned it into a tactical victory. He used the 5 months of negotiations to prepare an attack against one of Hekmatyar's rival groups and secure his own supply routes. While negotiating peace with the Soviets, he was gaining ground against fellow Mujahideen rivals. He was playing on multiple boards at once. The Soviet Achilles heel, helicopters, and the Stinger. At the start of the invasion, the Mi-24 Hind helicopter was considered the war's ultimate weapon. Armored in critical areas, fast, armed with 12.7mm cannons, unguided rockets, and anti-tank missiles, able to operate over terrain where ground vehicles were vulnerable. The first months seemed to confirm it. The Mujahideen, without air defenses, simply fled when Hinds appeared on the horizon. Soviet commanders celebrated it as the final answer to mountain guerrillas. Lieutenant Colonel Aksamov described how air support worked when everything went right. The forward air controller called in the attack helicopters and directed their fire. Meanwhile, the rear platoons swept the western part of the village. The soldiers advanced under the cover of the BMPs and helicopter fire. The enemy withdrew under this decisive action. When air support was available and accurate, it made the difference. But the Mujahideen watched, learned, and adapted. They discovered that at high altitude, Mi-24 engine performance dropped noticeably, making it slower and less maneuverable. They found that in narrow gorges, it had critical blind spots directly beneath and to the sides. They learned that the airframe, while armored in key areas, was vulnerable elsewhere. High-caliber rifles from World War II, in the hands of skilled shooters firing from elevated positions above the helicopter's flight path, began inflicting losses on crews. Then came SAM-7 missiles supplied by Egypt and China through the ISI. Outdated by NATO standards, but effective enough against helicopters flying low. Soviet pilots learned to fly higher to avoid them, which reduced accuracy against mountainous targets and significantly weakened close support for troops on the ground. But the truly decisive shift arrived in 1986 with the introduction of American Stinger missiles. The first documented Stinger use in Afghanistan, September 26, 1986 near Jalalabad, brought down 3 Soviet helicopters in a single action. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In under a year, the Soviets had lost dozens of aircraft. More important than material losses, though, was the change the Stingers imposed on flight doctrine. Higher altitude, higher speed, constant evasive maneuvers. All of it drastically reduced the support helicopters could provide to ground troops. The air superiority that had been the Soviet ace in the hole during the war's early years no longer existed in the same way. Helicopters still flew, but not with the same freedom or aggression as before. and that difference proved strategically decisive in the final years. Internal collapse, disease, morale, and attrition. Combat casualties were the visible problem. The invisible one was worse in many ways, and in 1981, it nearly collapsed the 40th Army operationally, without the Mujahideen firing a single additional shot. The health crisis was devastating. There wasn't enough proper shelter for the country's extreme climate, nor appropriate food, nor basic sanitation, nor sufficient medical supplies, nor enough doctors. Rates of hepatitis, typhoid, dysentery, malaria, and cholera exploded to levels commanders tried to hide in reports but could not conceal in the reality of field hospitals. A Soviet nurse who served in Afghanistan described what she found in her ward. There were supposed to be 30 beds. There were 300 men lying there. Typhoid, malaria. They were given sheets and a blanket and lay on the floor in their underwear, their heads shaved, and lice cascaded off them. I had never imagined so many lice. Psychological wear ran parallel to physical breakdown. The average Soviet soldier in Afghanistan was an 18 or 19-year-old conscript, often drafted from the USSR's Asian republics or rural regions of Russia, with no understanding of why he was in that country. Official propaganda spoke of brotherly assistance to the Afghan people, socialist internationalism defending the revolution, but the reality a soldier saw every day was fundamentally incompatible with that story. He saw villagers who looked at him with hatred. He saw comrades killed in routine ambushes. He saw an allied Afghan army deserting en masse, its loyalty permanently suspect. And he saw that after months of operations, after dozens of casualties in his unit, the territory pacified yesterday was back in Mujahideen hands tomorrow. The obvious question, one no one in the chain of command could answer convincingly, was what any of it was for. Cargo 200, the zinc coffins carrying dead soldiers back to their families in silence, at night, with no public ceremonies, no visible military honors, so the scale of losses wouldn't become public, became one of the most powerful symbols of the war inside Soviet society. Many conscripts returned with severe opium addictions, because opium was abundant and cheap in Afghanistan. Many came back with trauma the Soviet health system wasn't equipped to treat, and many returned with a deep mistrust of the system that had sent them there, contributing to the ideological erosion Gorbachev would face when he came to power. The war also produced brutality that created more enemies than it eliminated. In Kunduz on December 22, 1984, Soviet troops executed 250 civilians in an episode that even Soviet advisor Alexander Yuriev acknowledged in his memoirs helped alienate the population further. Kandahar is a very beautiful city, but half of it is destroyed. Streets and entire blocks in ruins. The rebels fire from the outer green zone and set ambushes inside the city. We control only 2 of the 6 districts. The other 4 are in rebel hands. That's what he wrote in 1984, 5 years after the invasion began. Soviet adaptations, late but real. It would be unfair to portray the Red Army as incapable of learning. It did learn. Over 9 years, stubbornly and sometimes with tactical brilliance. The problem was that it almost always learned too late and applied lessons too inconsistently to change the strategic outcome. The most important structural shift came relatively early. By 1982, the 40th Army had traded out tank and air defense units designed for European war in exchange for more infantry capable of operating in mountainous terrain. Former Chief of the General Staff Nikolai Ogarkov was the intellectual architect of this transformation, pushing reforms that emphasized small unit combat, combined arms operations, and specialized training for Afghan conditions. A private who went through that training described it in revealing detail. We built mock-ups of Afghan villages. Under the cover of infantry fighting vehicles, we would level the village. We also trained at night. Quietly, we captured house by house, strong point by strong point. We carried bayonets and suppressors on our rifles, and we learned how to use them. They didn't hide from us that we were going to Afghanistan. That was training for night and urban fighting in specifically Afghan terrain, not the European battlefield prep of their predecessors. The army also adopted new tools, more grenade launchers integrated into infantry units, RPO flamethrowers to clear positions in rocky terrain, specialist squads to counter Mujahideen snipers, old tanks converted to detonate mines on roads. Small adjustments that, together, improved day-to-day operational effectiveness. Spetsnaz became the most effective instrument of all. Small teams of 4 to 12 men, no heavy vehicles, able to move at night on foot through terrain where mechanized convoys were easy targets. They intercepted Mujahideen supply routes, eliminated mid-level commanders, and inflicted damage disproportionate to their size. A Soviet airborne soldier who took part in these operations in the Eastern Mountains described the intensity of combat. "I remember every battle, every man I killed, like the one in the white turban shouting Allahu Akbar in a frantic scream as he jumped from a 5-meter rock after mortally wounding my friend. His guts ended up on my shirt, and his brains on the butt of my rifle. Only wild animals found our dead comrades in the mountains, and for their parents, we invented heroic feats they supposedly performed." The problem was that Spetsnaz were never numerous enough to have strategic impact across such a vast theater. They were a brilliant tactical tool, serving a fundamentally flawed strategy. The flow of money and weapons. How the world changed the war. While the Red Army tried to adapt on the ground, the scale of external support for the Mujahideen grew at a pace that transformed their combat capability year after year. In 1981, CYA support was limited to $15 million, matched by Saudi Arabia, and light weapons flowing through Pakistan's ISI. By January 1984, the CIA had already spent $200 million on the war. Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson had turned Afghanistan into his personal crusade, pressuring Washington to increase the flow of funds and weapons. CIA officer Gus Avrakotos coordinated with him behind the scenes, keeping the pipeline moving while the agency tried to keep a low profile amid the Iran-Contra scandal. President Reagan folded Afghanistan into a global narrative. "We cannot remain passive when freedom is under siege. We must stand by all our democratic allies. We must not break faith with those who risk their lives on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to resist Soviet-supported aggression." For Washington, backing the Mujahideen was more than a covert operation. It was an ideological statement. China sold Soviet-standard weapons directly to Mujahideen factions, making origin harder to trace while benefiting China's own military budget. Saudi Arabia matched American contributions dollar for dollar. By the mid-1980s, the Mujahideen were no longer fighting only with World War II-era rifles. They had RPGs, recoilless rifles, mortars, and after 1986, Stingers that effectively closed the sky over the Hindu Kush. Mujahideen operational sophistication grew alongside available weaponry. In December 1982, they attacked Kabul's power grid in a coordinated operation that caused blackouts across the capital. One participant described it like this: "Our commander ordered us to prepare the explosives and bury mines throughout the substation, from one end to the other. They all had to detonate the same night. We didn't just destroy the pylons, we cut the cables too. When we finished our operation, the other groups attacked the military posts in the area." Coordination, synchronization, strategic infrastructure targets. This was no longer only road ambush guerrilla warfare. The most striking example of that evolution was the underground base at Zawar in the east. Its tunnels reached 500 meters and included a hotel, a mosque, weapons depots, repair workshops, a garage, a medical post, a radio center, and a kitchen. A gasoline generator supplied electricity to the tunnels, and a detail that says a lot about the builder's mindset, to the hotel's video player. The base became a must-see for journalists, American congressmen, and other observers who wanted to see with their own eyes what the Mujahideen had built while the Red Army tried to destroy them. The refugee crisis, the war behind the war. No analysis of this war's tactics is complete without addressing its largest consequence: the refugee exodus that reshaped the region's demographics and created conditions for the radicalization that would shape the world for decades. By 1984, 3.5 million Afghans were living in refugee camps in Pakistan, with nearly 1.5 million more in Iran. It was one of the largest population displacements of the 20th century. And it wasn't driven by Mujahideen guerrilla warfare. It was a direct result of the Soviet strategy of pressuring civilians to isolate insurgents. Bombing villages suspected of sheltering Mujahideen, systematically destroying irrigation systems and farmland, deploying mines specifically designed to maim rather than kill, creating victims who drained medical resources and terrified communities. This was all part of a deliberate tactic to empty the countryside of the population sustaining the resistance. An Afghan woman who fled with her family described the moment that changed everything. "When I heard the sound of the plane, I took my daughter out of the house. My son was still inside. Before I could reach him, a bomb fell. It killed him." Millions of stories like that, multiplied by millions, explain why rural Afghanistan emptied and why refugee camps in Pakistan became radicalization hubs the ISI used to recruit the next generation of jihadists. Those camps were the seedbeds where the ISI selected, trained, and indoctrinated the fighters it preferred, markedly favoring the most Islamist and radical factions. The children who grew up there knew no life but war and the mullah's sermon. Many of them would later fill the ranks of the Taliban. The moment of truth. Gorbachev and the withdrawal. By 1985, with Mikhail Gorbachev newly in power in Moscow, it was obvious to anyone willing to see reality that the war was strategically lost. Not because the Red Army had been militarily destroyed, but because guerrilla tactics had achieved their deeper goal, making the cost of continuing unacceptable to Soviet society and leadership. Gorbachev called Babrak Karmal and told him bluntly what he thought. Lenin said that one criterion for the survival of any revolution is its ability to defend itself. Soviet troops cannot remain in Afghanistan forever. It was a message Karmal didn't want to hear, but couldn't ignore. Gorbachev gave the Politburo hawks one last attempt, one final wave of operations with more special forces, focused on cutting supply routes from Pakistan and achieving visible victories that could justify an honorable withdrawal. The results were mixed at best. The ninth and final Panjshir campaign ended without strategic change. Massoud escaped again. Mujahideen bases in the east withstood prolonged sieges. Scholar William Miley analyzed it with a precision worth quoting. The Soviet-Afghan War was not made up of a series of decisive events, an Austerlitz, a Waterloo, a Stalingrad, a D-Day, or a Hiroshima, but rather a harsh routine of medium-intensity engagements, none capable of delivering strategic victory to either side, yet with a massive cumulative effect, especially in the mind of a Soviet leadership in transformation. That was exactly what the guerrillas had achieved. Not victory on the battlefield, victory in the mind of Soviet leadership. In 1988, Gorbachev signed the Geneva Accords. On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov crossed the bridge over the Amu Darya River, the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghan territory. 9 years, 1 month, and 18 days after the first entry, more than 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, more than 35,000 wounded, tens of thousands of veterans carrying trauma and addictions, more than 1 million Afghans dead, more than 5 million refugees, and the Soviet Union, which entered Afghanistan at the peak of its imperial power, would leave in an accelerating decline from which it would never recover. Gorbachev had 3 more years to try to reform the system. It wasn't enough. Conclusion. We've just traveled through 9 years of tactical war in the mountains of Central Asia, from the first convoys shredded in the Kunar Valley, where paratroopers dropped onto enemy positions and an armored column drove into an ambush, to the stingers that handed the sky back to guerrillas on the ground. From Massoud's intellectual discipline, organizing elastic defense in Panjshir, to Zinki, coffins arriving silently to Soviet families at night. From Zawar's tunnels, complete with a hotel and a video room, to the refugee camps in Pakistan that manufactured the next generation of jihadists. What emerges from all of this is not that the Red Army was incompetent. It wasn't. It was a formidable force that learned, adapted, and produced brilliant tacticians at the individual and small unit level. What emerges is that it arrived with the wrong tools for the wrong problem, in terrain that erased its strengths and amplified its weaknesses, against an enemy driven by convictions no Marxist analysis could predict and no military reprisal could extinguish. The central lesson is uncomfortable, precisely because it isn't unique to that army or that war. A conventional power, no matter how materially overwhelming, fights with a structural disadvantage when it faces a people fighting on their own ground with motivation that goes beyond military obedience. Technology can win battles. It cannot buy the will of a people determined to resist. And the final warning is the most uncomfortable of all. The tactics that humiliated the Red Army in Afghanistan didn't vanish with the Soviet withdrawal. The fighters who learned and perfected them stayed active. The networks built to finance the jihad kept operating. Training camps kept producing combatants. And 12 years later, the country that armed those guerrillas to defeat the USSR would send its own soldiers into the same mountains to fight the same tactical ghosts. The geography didn't change. The lessons didn't either. If you want to know how this story continued, what happened to Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal, how those training camps created the conditions for September 11th, and how the United States entered the same mountains 20 years later, the next video is waiting for you. This has been Battles in Action. Hit like if you made it to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdowns. And share if you think more people should know this story. Until the next battle.